Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tassisius Kabu Taulaka, and I work at the Center for Pacific Island Studies. Welcome to another Resilient Pacific seminar for this afternoon. This is a collaboration between the Center for Pacific Island Studies and the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My co-host is McKenna Kaufman from the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience. And we also have helping us organize this is James Viennes and Ida Arick, who do a lot of the background work for these seminars. A couple of things, housekeeping things. First, this is recorded, and the only people recorded are the conveners and the speaker. So those of you who are attending as guests, you will not be in the recording. This will later be posted on the CIPA's YouTube, so you can go there and use it as resources. The second thing is at the end of the talk, we will have Q&A, and if you can post your questions in the Q&A folder rather than in the chat, that way it makes it easier for us to go through it. So thank you very much to all of you for attending this afternoon. I'd like to specifically thank Gary Holton for giving the talk this afternoon. Gary is a professor of linguistics here at UH Manoa, where he also serves as director of the Catalog of Endangered Languages and co-director of the Biocultural Initiative of the Pacific. Gary, thank you very much for giving up your time and for sharing with us your knowledge. And Gary will be talking on language vitality as resilience in the Pacific and beyond. Again, thank you very much, Gary, and I hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And and thank you so much to the CIPAS and to the Sustainability Institute for this invitation. Aloha, everyone. It's nice to see all those names out there, to have this chance to connect a little bit in a time when we don't get very much in the way of face-to-face connection. And hopefully this is maybe a poor substitute, but some kind of substitute for that. Let me share my screen here before I continue. Here we go. Yeah, when McKenna first asked me about presenting in this series, I was thinking about resilience and language, and the first thing that came to mind is how do we deal with doing language work in the Pacific in the middle of a pandemic? And I guess I was kind of mired in that thinking, but I decided not to go that route and not talk about COVID, and it's maybe a good thing I did. So pardon me for this shameless plug. Actually, next week, if you're interested, my colleague Brad McDonald and I and several students from the Department of Linguistics will be giving a panel on precisely that issue of how language work is dealing with the pandemic and dealing with remote field work, and how we think that's very much changing the way that that linguistics is happening, the way that language documentation is happening, across the Pacific and is likely to have an enduring effect, I think. So, but that's not today's talk. So today's talk is about resilience in a different sense. So I thought I covered a few different topics in trying to get to linguistics. So I wanted to talk a little about language endangerment. Maybe that's something that many of you are familiar with, more or less. So, but it may be worth reviewing a little bit. And I want to talk about something called documentary linguistics. If somebody asks me to say, you know, what am I as an academic? I say I'm a documentary linguist. So I'll say a little bit about what that means. And then I want to talk about some of the intersections between language and biocultural diversity and the implications of that. And that will kind of bring us to talking about resilience and the implications and how I see resilience as working within language. And I don't have a whole lot of answers, but I'll throw out maybe just some things that we can discuss, and hopefully there's some time that we can have some discussion following that. Okay, so that's the plan. So let's start with language endangerment. So you are probably all well aware that languages are endangered. There are some 7,000 or so languages across the world, depending on how you count. But that count is looking at really distinct languages, not even including all the dialect variation that happens within those languages. And at least 3,000 or so, 3,394 by the count of Lyle Campbell and Anna Ballou from 2017, are endangered. That is, they're no longer being learned actively by children. They have fewer than 1,000 speakers. The numbers of speakers are decreasing over time, and they tend to be used not outside the home, so not in the wider domain, right? They wouldn't be used, say, in a talk like this, but they. This is a huge issue that's having a whole lot of impacts across the globe. And you're probably well aware of this. I'm going to skip through this slide in the interest of time. So let me just say a couple of things about language endangerment that I think maybe are perhaps less obvious, right? I think many people are aware that, hey, there are endangered languages out there, right? Anyone that is involved working in the Pacific, working in and living in Hawaii is aware of this. But here are a couple of things that you may not be as aware of. One point to be aware of is that language endangerment does not proceed in a uniform way, right? It cuts across different areas of the community and different domains of knowledge, right? So language endangerment affects ages differently. So their language may be more endangered amongst younger people than amongst older people. May be extremely endangered in urban areas, but not so much so in rural areas. That is true of the history of Hawaiian language, for example. There is often a loss of specific genre when other ones survive. So oratory may be more endangered than other aspects of, say, everyday language. There is loss of domains, like specialized knowledge, like botanical knowledge may disappear more quickly than everyday type of knowledge. Similarly with registers, formal speech may be lost while casual speech is preserved, or vice versa, right? It may well be that casual speech is what disappears more quickly and formal rhetorical styles stick around. But these things proceed very unevenly. So sometimes when we're looking at making maps of where languages are endangered, we tend to think of endangerment as this monolithic thing, but it may well be that everyone's speaking the language in a very kind of simplified, casual way on a daily basis, but certain domains of knowledges may be disappearing. So that map I showed with the 3,000 or so languages is a gross underestimate of how much endangerment there really is in the world if we started to think about loss of domains, loss of registers, loss of genre, the age grading effects, and what's happening in urban versus rural populations. So it really changes our picture of what endangerment is. One further thing to mention is the lack of digital support. Now, there are lots of apps and things for supporting endangered languages, but very few languages allow me to do what I'm doing right now. That is using a computer, using Zoom, and communicating digitally. One study found that only 16 of the world's languages are digitally thriving. And actually, this was going on a decade ago that this study was done. Digitally thriving means having things like a Wikipedia, having, being able to use Facebook in your language, being able to, use your phone in your language. These are things we do now, like almost every minute of our lives, right? So if a language isn't something that I can use in this form, it's going to be very hard for it to thrive in what is now, I think that's an understatement to say it's an increasingly digital world. It is a digital world now, and very few languages are prepared to thrive in that world. So at the risk of being a kind of bringer of bad news, the picture of language endangerment is much worse than most assessments have made it out to be, unfortunately. Okay, one other aspect of language endangerment is that we're not just talking about endangerment of particular languages, we're talking about endangerment of the diversity of human languages. So while it was once kind of thought that all languages are kind of the same, they're all just variants on a theme, other than some vocabulary differences, what we found over the last few decades of researching languages is that language is vary enormously. There's an incredible amount of diversity, right? And so we see now that the endangerment, we're not just looking at a loss of particular languages, we're looking at loss of diversity. And in some ways, this is diversity of kind of trivial things, like, okay, yeah, in Hawaiian we have verbs at the beginning of a sentence, and in English they're in the middle, and you could say that that's kind of trivial. But this diversity can be much deeper, right? For example, here's an example from a language not in the Pacific. I'm sorry I didn't grab a language example from the Pacific for this, but languages can vary in the way they implement spatial cognition. So here's just one example of this boy in the Holton language in Namibia. It's a Khoi language in northern Namibia. When asked to arrange objects on a table and then brought to another similar table, having rotated 90 degrees, so that the first table on the left there, he's facing south, and when he walks over to the other table, he's facing west. He organizes those, when asked to organize things the same way on the table on the right, the one where he's facing west, he organizes things so that the animals on the table are to the south, and the pen for the animals is to the north, even when these change. The language that he speaks encodes all of its spatial relationships in terms of east, south, north, and west. Unlike languages like English, which encode spatial relationships in an egocentric way based on the body, generally talking about left and right. So he's not organizing things on the left side or the right side of the table, he's organizing them according to north and south. Another language like Hawaiian might organize things according to whether things were to the high side or the uka side, the mountain side or the water side. These are huge differences that are not just embedded in language, but are affecting the way we actually live our daily lives, right? So this diversity is a diversity in human cognition, right? It infects the very being of who we are in humans. So diversity is huge. This is the kind of thing that's at risk with language endangerment, right? It's not just a simple matter of small differences of vocabulary and press the button on Google Translate and we can get an answer in another language. So Fortunately, there's been a huge response to what Michael Krauss described 30 years as the endangered language crisis. Right? We've had a number of funding regimes developed internationally that have dedicated streams of funding to go and document languages. The journal Language Documentation and Conservation, for example, was founded here at Manoa. A conference was begun a decade ago here at Manoa. We just had the 7th iteration of that conference a couple of weeks ago. So there has been a huge response to language endangerment, and that has led to this growth of what I'm calling here documentary linguistics. And documentary linguistics is a way of creating a record of language that is enduring, a record that others can refer to. And it's a holistic record that documents, as Nikolaus Himmelman writes, the linguistic practices of a speech community. And this is a sea change for linguistics in some ways, because it allows us to answer questions that we didn't think to ask at the time. That is, we create this record of language, and maybe I didn't think to ask some question of those speakers of that language, but the record allows me to answer that question later in time. It's a very different way of doing linguistics. Now, that said, people have been recording language for a long time, right? This is, before, we had this rise of structuralism and Chomskyism in the mid 20th century. Language documentation, recording language, was what people did. Maybe they did it in kind of a colonial way, but creating records was part of what was going on. I think the big change in this response to the endangered languages crisis is this move to a more data-driven empirical approach, that everything we do is grounded in creating a record and creating a traceable artifact, so that claims about languages can be rooted in the actual language data itself. Part of this is because it's made possible technologically, right? We can create this digital data that allows us to have that record. It allows us to create records which can be readily repurposed and reused for other purposes, say to create teaching materials or for other sorts of investigations. And in particular, I think a critical aspect of the new documentary linguistics is that it's been driven by language activism. Part of the response is to this recognition that of an endangered language crisis, but the driving force has been endangered languages communities themselves, right? So there's been this decolonization, a shift from research about languages to research by language communities. The kind of records that people create are recordings that are closely annotated, so that we have a transcript that is tied in a time-aligned fashion to the original, and then annotations such as translations into English or other languages of wider communication. These are then archived in various different places, such as the Kaupulehone archive here at Manoa, which is part of a larger international network called the Digital Endangered Languages and Music's Archives Network. And this creates this enduring permanent record of language. Okay, moving right along. I wanted to say a little bit about the intersection of language and biocultural diversity. Where does that figure in here? Well, there's a few ways. One is that this language as a species metaphor has been around for a long time, right? Since this endangered languages crisis was brought to mind, right, we've been thinking about language as behaving like a living organism, right? That it has this endless complexity, it's evolving in the same way. It has this kind of internal diversity like species. It's a part of an ecosystem. Where you're probably familiar with the metaphor of the family tree to talk about languages. So language is evolving from a common ancestor and then giving rise to related languages, which are siblings of each other. So we're kind of linguistics was ripe for thinking in this way, this kind of biological way. But the metaphor only goes so far, right? But I won't get. We can discuss that further if you like. I won't get into that here. But I just wanted to point out that there is kind of there was some motivation for it originally for thinking in this biological way. So if we take that thinking and start looking what's going on in the biological domain and compare that with what's going on in the linguistic domain, we find that language vitality tracks species vitality. That's what's happening in the with endangerment in the language world is very close to what's happening with endangerment in the ecological world, right? So here's part of a report where you can see the percentage of critically endangered languages or endangered languages tracks very similarly across various different families of fauna, birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Right? So this was kind of some of the initial sort of things that people started looking at, what's going on with these correlations, right? I'll skip over this. Like I said, we can discuss this more, that there are some limitations to this biological metaphor, but in particular that point that humans can participate in more than one language community. It's hard to be more than one species. Right? But feel free to ask about that if you want to return to it. Yeah, so what about these correlations? Well, again and again, as we keep looking at the biological world and the linguistic world, we find these relations. Like here is a correlation between the plant species diversity and language density, right? So where we find lots of diversity of languages, we also find lots of high density of languages. So tracking very closely together. This is just a map of the same idea where the plant diversity is given in the colors, and the black dots are the locations of languages. So you can see the diversity by the amount of the concentration of the black dots there. Just another study looking at degree of endemism in languages and higher vertebrates tracking together. Correlations between growing season, the mean growing season, which kind of tracks maybe the degree of tropicalness, and the numbers of languages, right? So more evidence of the two tracking together, right? And a correlation between biodiversity hotspots and biodiversity wilderness areas and language density. So these are just a few studies that I pulled out, right? There are many, many of these that repeatedly confirm that these correlations between biodiversity and linguistic diversity. So that's one sense in which language and biocultural diversity are connected. But there's another sense as well, right? That if we are to create this record of the linguistic practices of a speech community, suddenly linguistics is no longer simply about linguistic structure, right? Because a speech community speaks about something, right? It matters what the content of that speech stream is, right? So it's not possible for a speech community to disentangle the ecological knowledge embedded in the speech from the speech itself, any more than it's possible for that speaker of Gwich'in to separate his knowledge of spatial cognition of the world around him from the linguistic way of expressing that, right? So orienting himself in space is tied into using the language. You can't say, oh, I just want to document the language. I don't want to document spatial orientation. The two are interconnected. The same goes for just about every aspect of the biocultural world. And this is something that linguists are not necessarily always very good at. And that's the example that I put here is of a beautiful dictionary of Papua New Guinea language called Kalam that represents over 50 years of work, just a wonderful dictionary. I mean, you know, linguists geek out reading dictionaries, but if you were ever going to geek out and think that a dictionary is a cool thing to read, this is a good one. It's not just a list of words, it's a list of how people use things, how people relate to cultural objects, how it is just highly recommended if you feel like reading the dictionary in a spare time. But just before publication, the compilers, Ralph Bulmer and Andy Pauly, noticed that they didn't have any names for rocks. They just had kind of rock, right? And well, they got a geologist friend to go back with them, and geologist friend worked with people, came up with all kinds of names for rocks, just, you know, dozens of different terminology, or this whole rich terminology for describing rock. And Ralph Bulmer went and said, what the heck, guys? I've been working with you guys for decades. You never told me about rocks. And they supposedly said to him, this quote here on the bottom, they said, you know, it's pretty obvious you don't know a thing about rocks. Why should we bother talking to you about rocks? You don't know about rocks. But, you know, this guy you brought with me, the guy who you brought with you, he knows a lot about rocks, so we could tell him. I've had very similar experiences working with ethnobotanists, working with astronomers, and several domains. So doing documentary linguistics really requires this kind of interdisciplinary approach that incorporates knowledge of the environment, incorporates biocultural approaches. I don't know if I have, I'm not sure I have time to talk about this one, but I'll just maybe briefly mention one of my, I had a very similar experience to the one that Ralph Bulmer describes with star knowledge, where an Alaskan language, Dene language called Gwich'in, has this word Yahdi, which had been documented for 100 years or more, almost 200 years, as a name for a constellation that I know in English as the Big Dipper. Went out to work with a astronomer by the name of Chris Cannon, and within one day, I should say one evening, Chris was able to work out with people in the village that Yahdi was not the Big Dipper, but actually described a mega constellation that covers the entire sky, and various parts of Yahdi being a figure in the sky, a humanoid figure. Various parts of the sky could be named by body part asterisms, referring to, say, Yahdi's left foot, Yahdi's right foot, Yahdi's right hand, and so on, right? So this had been completely overlooked. But just as Ralph Bulmer didn't get told about rocks, nobody told me about stars, because they took one look at me and no, he doesn't know anything about stars. So, so documentary linguistics, in spite of its name, with the word linguistics in there, is not something linguists can do alone. It's something that very much requires interdisciplinary collaboration. So it's hard to say that a field is interdisciplinary, but because it's a field, right? But documentary linguistics is that. It is a field which happens to be inherently interdisciplinary. It's something linguists can't do by themselves. Okay, so enough about language and biocultural diversity. Let's move on to thinking about resilience, which is the topic of your seminar series, and so something I want to make sure we have some time to discuss. So what do we mean when we talk about language and resilience? There's a long history of this. In a way, there's a long history of people talking about resilience linguistics, but it's still kind of being worked out within the field. One person who has promoted this a lot, this idea on a lot, is a guy by the name of David Bradley, who compares, not compares, but makes use of this resilience concept of the adaptive cycle to think about language as going through these similar phases of stability and growth and decay and change that we would have in kind of the more traditional sort of socio-ecological model of resilience. And you can articulate this, as languages kind of growing and then stabilizing, so you have this period of languages growing rapidly. You have a slower period where languages are kind of more slowly evolving. You have language decline, language loss, and then you have kind of a shift and restructuring. And you could see this in the Pacific maybe as this rapid expansion across the Pacific of oceanic languages with lots of diversification as the languages grow and spread. You move on to this conservation phase of a more steady diversification in situ, and you find things like, say, Fiji, where you find this enormous variation in dialect diversity. People who have been there a long time, but it's given rise over time to this just enormous variation. And then you have a phase of language loss, and then maybe language reclamation as the reorganization phase. So it kind of works as a model, taking this traditional sort of adaptive cycle model. And many linguists continue, like David Bradley and others, continue to pursue this kind of model of resilience. But increasingly, people have pointed out some of the problems with this. And there's one recent paper published in our journal, Language Documentation and Conservation, which tries to examine this from a historical perspective by looking at an 800-year history of a couple of language families, one being the Sami languages of Northern Europe. And by tracing the history of those languages with data going back to the 12th century and looking at various factors of language vitality, it's possible to see that what happens with those vitality factors. And these are kind of standard factors that, how many speaker numbers, is a language being passed on to children? That's intergenerational transmission. Domains of use, as I mentioned, is there a shrinking domain, or is it just in the house, or is it also in the wider world that the language is being used, and so on. If you measure these across time, you find a shrinkage of all of those 5 factors as displayed in these diagrams on the right across time, until 1975, where you see this kind of explosion in several areas, except for speaker numbers. Right? You see a shift in everything except for an increase in number of speakers, and that's very much correlated to a change in language policy, with especially within the Nordic countries. Right. Here's another study from some languages spoken on the northern Tibetan plateau. Similar sort of diagrams, right? You see this shrinkage of that black area across time. You see in the 1980 to 2000 period, number 6 here, you see a little bit of expansion. Again, a change in language policy locally that led in the way the languages were being treated by the government, languages and peoples. But then continued shrinkage. What you don't see here over this 800-year period of time is a cyclic effect. You don't see expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. Right? You see a kind of one-way street of decay, and any deviation from that seems to be due to external agency, right? These changes coming from the nation states, as opposed to something happening within the language. So it's not clear that this traditional adaptive cycle really fits with what's going on in language. the jury's still out in this. There's lots of debate among linguists, but I think it's fair to characterize that the model doesn't work perfectly. That said, I think there's another aspect to resilience which is very much worth looking at, and this is the resilience that comes from well-being and the protective factors that language can confer to a community. This was actually the theme of the International Conference on Language Documentation and Conservation here a few years ago. It's continued to be of increasing importance amongst documentary linguists. I'd say much growing even since 2017. What we find is that language is very well shown now to be a protective factor for Indigenous communities. So I'll give a few kind of examples here. This is just the tip of the iceberg of some of the work that's been done, right? So here's some studies from Northern Territories that show the mortality rate amongst this cohort that has greater use of traditional language as compared to all of Northern Territory taken as a whole, has lower mortality, better health outcomes. Language in many of these studies is being used as a proxy for cultural continuity. Why? Because cultural continuity is a concept that's very difficult to measure. Language is something that we have measurements for. So here's a study from Alberta, where Alberta has the Alberta Health Services has very good data on diabetes rates, as well as language usage rates. There's been very good census data. And we find a very close correlation between percentage of Indigenous knowledge, as that's measured, awkward measure, admittedly, but percentage of Indigenous knowledge correlating inversely with diabetes prevalence. Right? One more, just to give you an idea of the range, here's a more recent study looking at mental health in Aboriginal Australia. And you can see the significant values are those ones with the asterisks on top, right? And again, we see people who identify with Indigenous L1 there is first language, or even with, in many cases with Indigenous L2, that means they're first language speakers of English, but have learned or relearned their Aboriginal language, all performing better on measures of various measures of mental health. So language, Indigenous language knowledge, Indigenous language use being correlated significantly with better health and well-being outcomes. Okay, so where do we go from here? I'll try to wrap things up here. So the recognition of endangered language crisis has led to this reemergence of documentary linguistics as a field. The links between linguistic and biocultural diversity support a holistic documentary linguistics. That is one that is integrative, is interdisciplinary, has to work with other disciplines in order to proceed. And the links between language and vitality and well-being suggest that language revitalization is a protective factor, that it does convey a resilience in this sense, regardless of what you might claim about the workings of the applicability of the adaptive cycle to language. So I think this takes us toward, or back toward, an ecology of language, right? That we need to think holistically about language vitality. We can't revitalize languages individually, but we can revitalize language communities. And there's a really nice example of this, and maybe we can discuss this further, right here in Hawaii. I think this is a brilliant example. If we think about what's going on with Ölelo Hawai'i here in Hawaii, people often ask, why is it that Hawaiian revitalization has succeeded where other efforts fail? Now, grant me that, okay, you can argue about success of Hawaiian revitalization, and we can get into details there and get into the weeds. But clearly, people from across the world come to visit Hawaii to learn from the success, to see how they can bring that success back to their communities, right? What is different here? What has made that possible? Well, Daviana McGregor has pointed out, as have others, that there's an openness to outsiders that dates back to the Hawaiian kingdom, right? That the Hawaiian kingdom was not just racially defined. Others have also pointed out that in Hawaii, the language equals culture equation is less strong. That doesn't mean that language isn't critical to culture. It is. No one would claim otherwise. But there are multiple routes into culture, right? I can have routes into culture through navigation, learning traditional agriculture, hula, and so on. Also, Hawaiian identity is dispersed in the sense that many people in Hawaii, whether they identify today as Kanaka Maoli or not, can trace a heritage of common colonial domination, of shared interests, and even shared relationships to the language, leading Hawaiian today to have this high visibility as a prestige language, a prestige identity, right? So there's a ecosystem of language that even among those who aren't directly participating in Hawaiian language revitalization have some role to play. You have things like, you may be familiar with the football terminology at Anuenue School, right? That and there's many examples of this all over the islands, right? This doesn't count as full revitalization, maybe, but it's participating in that ecosystem of revitalization, right? It allows more people to engage so that revitalization doesn't become a black and white, either you're learning the language or you're not, but there are many different ways into that. So this forces us to rethink what we mean by vitality. What counts as success, right? Does it have to be oral fluency that we're talking about, or can we allow the goals of revitalization and language reclamation to be set by the community? As Andy Cowell says in that quote at the bottom, it's language revitalization. It's not just about learning and knowing a language, but using and living in it, right? Pila Wilson and Keiki Kava'aea have say this nice quote that this is coming from a teacher manual on instructing teachers on how to teach Hawaiian language. They say, it's not about the content you're instructing. It's about the whole system that's built around it, right? That system includes football players that are maybe not learning Hawaii, but are using learning Hawaiian, but they're using terminology in the football game, right? So it's this system of structures, this ecosystem that supports language vitality, right? And so how do we apply resilience thinking to language vitality? I think this provides us a pathway, right? That language maintenance, whatever that is, in whatever form, is a key contributor to communities. We need to recognize that. We need to get past the idea that language somehow is creating deficient students or deficient children, right? We need to get past that kind of English-only mentality and recognize the very clear evidence that Indigenous language has real benefits, tangible benefits. It's not just cool, it has health benefits, right? I mean, so we need to acknowledge that. Number two, we need to recognize that language revitalization is disruptive, right? Resilience doesn't mean preservation, right? Resilience means responding in a way that that provides a good outcome, right? So it's not just a return to where we were before, right? So that's a key point. Number three, we need to think about things from an ecological perspective, right? It's language revitalization cannot be an isolated effort. It has to create these structures that allow this wider participation in a language ecosystem. So that's all I have for today, and I hope I left a little bit of time for for discussion. There's some references. I can share this presentation too. You can, there's a bit.ly link there if you want to go to it later. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. This is really fascinating. Really great presentation. We'll open it up for questions. So if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A and we'll get it to Gary. While we're waiting for questions, I have one. So I know that your department, and particularly with language preservation, have done a lot of work in the Pacific Islands. And I'm wondering whether, in some of those work, I'm wondering whether there are studies on, I know it's too early, but I'm wondering whether there are studies on Pacific Island languages and newly emerging issues, such as climate change, for instance, or more recently, pandemic, particularly COVID-19, and whether, you are seeing the use of indigenous Pacific Island languages to talk about these very important issues that are at the forefront of a lot of the political discussions, both locally as well as internationally. So, yeah.
Yeah, a good question. I don't know if in the climate change arena, I don't know of any recent work coming out there. Certainly the pandemic has generated a huge amount of work. There's been an effort globally called Viral Languages, which made an effort to translate information about COVID into languages across the world. And what was interesting about this initiative is that, actually I said translate, but that's not correct. It wasn't just a matter of translating some materials from the UN or from WHO. It was actually working with communities to talk about what it means to have a pandemic and how to react. And because of that engagement, there's several students in our department who have been working that's led to closer working relationships. This is actually something Brad McDonald and some of his students will be talking about in that seminar I mentioned next week at East West Center. But I think that level of engagement and actually thinking about what something means and how we should be responding to the pandemic is a really rich area for research. So. Yeah, it's not much of an answer, but I guess I should say that I think it's an important area that we need to go in, but we're probably just at the beginning of that.
Thank you. Others, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A. While we're waiting, I have another question, and I don't know, maybe this is a dumb question, but so we've seen a lot of work on language revitalization in places like Hawaii, and also Aotearoa, New Zealand. And you mentioned that in Hawaii, it's quite successful, and the diversity of means to revitalizing languages. I wonder whether there are comparisons between what's done here in Hawaii and what's done in New Zealand, and what the differences are that they've produced.
I mean, I would say there's a lot more similarities than differences. In the differences, I think, mostly involve, from my understanding, levels of state support. Right? So there is a lot more state support within Aotearoa for language, but the early language work here grew out of work coming from New Zealand, right? So the whole concept of the language nest and the building of the initial schools and that is modeled on that effort. So the two, I think, very much go hand in hand. We don't necessarily have the governmental structures. I mean, the funding for immersion education, or not immersion, but Hawaiian medium education is nowhere near the level that the funding is for Maori. And yet I still talk to people from New Zealand who complain about the level of funding there. So
Gary, I know you talked about language and technology, and I have a question here, and it reads, in regard to language revitalization, have there been studies looking at how Indigenous communities are utilizing technology to perpetuate their language?
Oh yeah, I mean, technology I think has been huge, especially texting. It allows a medium of communication at a distance. And so I think I mentioned that as languages are lost, they're not lost uniformly, right? So speech communities tend to get kind of fragmented, right? And so you now have communities all around the world that are able to meet through texting, through sending a WhatsApp chat, through getting together on Zoom. I work regularly with a group in Alaska where the last first language speaker of the language passed away more than 10 years ago. But yet every week, a group that spans the entire US and some in Europe get together to speak the language and to work on language learning. That group couldn't get together physically anywhere, right? So I think technology has allowed that sort of perpetuation of the language, and it's created a forum, I guess, right? It's created a venue where you can use the language even if your neighbor doesn't speak the language. Your neighbor may not, but your neighbor on Zoom does.
Mm-hmm. And that raises another question. You mentioned earlier on about doing studies on language revitalization during the COVID period and not having the ability to go out into the field. And I know that there is a seminar next week that will look at that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Not to give up the things that you'll talk about next week, but what are some of the...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I may not have as diverse range of experiences that our students have had. I'm in a little bit of a privileged position, right? That I can put things on hold and wait to do field work until after COVID. Someone writing their PhD dissertation has to get their work done some way or another. And I think people have been extremely innovative in how they do that. And I guess what's been amazing for me is how possible that's been to do. I mean, a year ago, I would not have expected. A year ago, I was in the middle of teaching the field methods course. It was a very in-person thing where we kind of practice being in the village, working with speakers and see what it's like to, try to facilitate learning the language and ask questions that help us to learn the language and make recordings. And it's a very in-person, hands-on sort of thing. And I just thought, how would you ever do that is on Zoom? Well, we're doing it. It's in the same way that we're meeting here today may not be ideal, but it works. I've been really impressed with how well language documentation has worked over Zoom, over WhatsApp, over various different methods like that. And speakers, I think, are used to that kind of engagement now. So I think it will really change the way linguistics happens, right? That we won't have to have these periods where academic linguist flies in from Hawaii and once a year or once every 2 years, but that engagement can be ongoing. And my hope is that that's a much more empowering model for communities, right? It doesn't have this kind of separation in time and space. It allows that collaboration to continue instead of just being kind of sporadic. So if there are silver linings from the pandemic, I think that's one that could truly change the way we do field work. And wow, it reduces our carbon footprint too, right? So yeah. And one more thing I'll add is that I think it's required a lot more people to step up, right? So that people in communities are making recordings themselves and doing work that they might have said, oh, I'll wait for some linguist to come from the university and do that. Well, that linguist isn't coming. So they're learning to do the recording, and they're leading that effort in a way that, not that they wouldn't do it before, but when there's not someone else to do it, you step up and do it. And that's been really cool to see that level of empowerment too.
Gary, it's such a fascinating topic, and I thank you very much for giving up time to share your knowledge with us, and looking forward to the seminar next week. So on behalf of the Center for Pacific Island Studies and the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. Thank you. And thank you also to our participants for joining us. And we'll see you guys next week again. Thank you.